Happy to be talking to Professor Matthew Frye Jacobson about his recent book, One Grain of Sand, that was published by Bloomsbury Academic Press in 2019. Let me ask you a particular question about her relationship to religion, which, as you said, is a primary focus of one of your four sections. So you quote Odetta registering some distrust of institutional religion, or at least the leaders of institutional churches in the post-war period. She would later recall that, quote, "I didn't believe anything the ministers said. When the music started, I trusted that." Could you talk a little bit more about?
Yeah, that was, this was not an easy piece of writing for me for several reasons. One, I'm not Christian, and I'm not an African-American Christian. So there's some sensitivity about how are you going to approach materials like this. So there's that. But there's also, I think, the historian's tendency, and I think this runs pretty deep in the civil rights history as a genre, to take too literally some of the liberationist strains of Christian theology and to kind of map them onto the politics of the time. And clearly that was important. It's important that the Black church was such a crucial site for the struggle in the 1940s and 50s. That's where a figure like Martin Luther King emerges from. It's crucial that King himself is citing chapter and verse all the time in his political oratory. So these things are important, but I think they're too easily oversimplified. This particular chapter was something that I struggled with because I think I oversimplified it myself. I really just tried to read African-American Christianity as liberation theology and to kind of too facilely read the political symbolism of the ways that a figure like Odetta was using the Gospels. And I was fortunate to be corrected in that by our colleague Katie Lofton in religious studies, who read an early draft of the chapter and said, no, you have to understand that Christianity is a problem too. It's not just the answer to the problem; it's also part of the problem. And she gave me some reading assignments, including a fantastic book by another of our colleagues, Willie Jennings, on racism and the Christian tradition. Along with many other things. And it was actually through the rethinking that Katie Lofton had urged that I actually found some of those quotes, including the one that you just mentioned from Odetta herself, talking about religion in a much more problematized way, in a richer way. And so one of the things I tried to do in that chapter is not just lose the liberationist strand of Christian theology and Christian symbology, but also to try to capture some of the complexities and even the paradoxes that are embedded in it, in the ways that if it is true that Christianity was one of the symbol systems for imagining liberation on the part of the slaves, it was also one of the symbol systems that allowed for slavery in the first place. And so to try to really think about that paradox and to think about how that carries through over the 100 years leading up to 1963, when Odetta is singing, and how she's kind of positioning herself in relation to those paradoxes and those kind of contending streams.
So the book in part positions Odetta in dialogue with, contention with, in some ways, Christian theology, Christian churches, churchgoers, all developing at a time in which the civil rights movement is changing. You also think about Odetta, as you mentioned already, as a figure shaped by the Great Migration. And I'd love to hear you talk more about that. You say, that at least a few of her songs, quote, belong to the vast cross-genre canon of post-migration Black narratives alongside Jacob Lawrence's Migration series, Richard Wright's 12 Million Black Voices, Langston Hughes's One-Way Ticket, or Bessie Smith's Gulf Coast Views. So can you say more about how her work produced outside of the South, for the most part, engaged historical and contemporary conditions in that region and understandings of the South?
So the two songs that I really focus on in this context are Cotton Fields and Boll Weevil, both of which are about the South. But the argument I try to make is that they're very much they're performed outside of the South, and they're performed for the most part for people who have removed themselves from the South, but that dimension is really important. So they're a kind of backward reflection on not just a kind of geographical space, but a kind of historical space as well. So there's a temporal and spatial geography to those songs that I think is really important. And so it's not as literally the kind of migration narrative that so many other writers and including singers made famous. But I think it's in a similar genre in the sense that these are songs that could not have been performed this way, nor been thought of as important in this way, if they weren't on the other side of the experience of the migration, and if they weren't in some ways a reflection back onto a space that had been successfully escaped. I mean, that I guess is the thing that really defines them. And I think it's very subtle. One of the things I argue is that if you listen really closely, and especially in Cotton Fields, I think it's most subtle, and maybe it takes some study to really hear it. But there's a kind of agitation in her version of that song that really speaks about the danger and the hazards and the violence of the South, and what it might mean to escape it, or what it might mean in the literal context of the lyrics to be entrapped within it.
So you urge us to think about Odetta alongside many other cultural figures in the mid and late 20th century. And I just want to throw out some names that appear in your book, One Grain of Sand, and just ask you to say something about one or more of them, about their relationship to Odetta and her work. I'm thinking of people like Paul Robeson, Josh White, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Nina Simone, Bernice Johnson Reagan, and others.
The name that jumps out at me is Robertson, because I think that his approach to art was very much the approach that Odetta herself adopted. And whether she got it directly from him or indirectly through many of the mutual acquaintances that they had, I'm not sure. But his idea that artistic expression could be political expression was absolutely important to how she thought about her task as a singer. And also, I mean, the way that I think as a stylist, if that's the right word, Robertson was famous for performing in this kind of operatic mode that disrupted the expectations, especially of white audiences. But it kind of busted some of the genres of African-American performance at the time in a way that I think was really important and really powerful. And I think that is something that Odetta took as well, because as careful as an archivist as she was, in studying these old African-American standards in the Smithsonian collections and the like, she was never simply trying to reproduce what she was hearing. She actually was making the songs her own in a really important way. And the way I ended up putting it is that she inhabits the moral center of a song more than just reproducing the textures of the archive as she found it. And I think that that's a similar way, although his style was completely different. I think that Robeson did something very similar. When he sang a song with that just booming operatic voice, he was doing something that the archive was not giving him, but he was bringing his own special kind of power to it. And I think that that's something that she had in common with him.